All right, so let's get started. As Nick mentioned, my name is Andrew Paris, and tonight we're going to begin, and the keyword is begin because we only really have an hour this evening. We're going to begin to explore anti-racism. So just before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people, where I'm thankful to live, work, and play. As privileged advocates and agents of change, we need to recognize that we all have the responsibility to work towards truth and reconciliation and to remain open to suggestions and consultations, especially with local Indigenous communities, on how we can repair harm and restore balance. Now, if you've joined us for multiple sessions, you know what's coming next. I really want to emphasize that this land acknowledgement is just merely words on the screen and doesn't necessarily lead to reconciliation on its own. So my question to you folks is, how can we change these words into action? My challenge to you is to continue this by learning about the land that you reside on as a settler and digging in further or continuing your learning about your community's relationship with local Indigenous folks. So for those who perhaps this is your first time joining us, like I said, my name is Andrew. My pronouns are he, him, and il pour nos amis qui parlent français. I'm a non-disabled cisgendered Black man. I have the privilege of being a parent to Elijah, Kendra, and Hamilton the dog, who you won't hear this evening because he's just came back from doggy daycare and he's exhausted. I'm a settler in Mi'kma'ki, commonly known today as Nova Scotia. And before I'm joining the team at Inclusion Incorporated, I've spent 17 years working with the provincial government here in Nova Scotia and various community, provincial, and national sport organizations. So my background really is in this intersection of equity, diversity, and inclusion in sport. So what are we talking about this session? We're going to explore deeper the concept of race and how that manifests into racism. Keyword is the concept of race. Keep that idea parked in the back of your mind for a moment. We're also going to explore what anti-racism means. And lastly, we'll talk about what being anti-racist means versus not being racist. Je suis bilingue, donc pour nos amis francophones, si vous avez des questions que vous aimeriez poser en français, n'hésitez pas à les poser dans le chat et je ferai mon mieux pour les répondre en français. And that's just a quick note for our friends who speak French, whose first language is French. By all means, feel free to put your questions into the chat and I will do my best to respond to them in French. I think what's important to know as we get into this session is I don't want to spend the next hour talking at you. Throughout this section, we're going to be doing some interactive activities combined with some personal reflection. We're also going to have a Mentimeter at the end here where we're going to divide into some breakout rooms and begin to reflect on some of the learnings that we've had today. As you're reflecting during this presentation, it's important to remember that I'm not talking about a specific person, and I hope that some of the things that we're talking about aren't seen as a direct critique of you. What I hope for is you reflect on is how everyday structures and systems impact and affect folks. We're also going to be talking about big concepts that reference physical characteristics. Lastly, and importantly, it's really important to remember that being part of a privileged group doesn't make you a bad person. We've talked about it in past sessions, but we must remember that we all have privilege, and privilege in and of itself isn't inherently a bad thing. So as we're learning about racism today, I want to set the following practices as we're learning together. First, you may feel discomfort at some points during this presentation. There may be some new learns or some unlearn that takes place during this workshop, and that can sometimes feel uncomfortable. But I encourage you to really take a moment and reflect and listen deeply to understand. Be sure to leave space for others to ask questions, and please feel free to take space as you need. Also, as we encourage you to interact in the workshop, if things get tough to hear, by all means, feel free to take a breath. Also recognize that for some of you, in particular racialized folks, support may be needed during the workshop. If that's the case, feel free to message myself or Nick, and we will work to get you any support that you may need. So with all that said, let's dive into what is race. So when we talk about race, it's really an arbitrary classification of modern humans, sometimes, especially formally, based on any or a combination of various physical characteristics of skin color, facial form, or eye shape. You'll notice there that I intentionally put arbitrary classification into the definition, because the reality is that race is a social construct. It's a social construct that was designed to use to hold power over others. So I have this video that I'm going to play, and since I could see Nick in my corner, I'm going to get you to put a thumbs up if you can hear this video.
You may think you know exactly what race you are, but how would you prove it if someone disagreed with you? The fact is, even though race drives a lot of social and political outcomes, race isn't real. One of the first people to attempt to categorize humans according to race was a German scientist around 1776. He came up with 5 different groups according to physical appearance and geographic origin of their ancestors. Americans of European descent eagerly bought into this type of thinking around the same time. Some historians have said the idea that there were different races helped them resolve the contradiction between a natural right to freedom and the fact of slavery. If whites were their own distinct category, then they could feel a lot better about denying freedom to people who they labeled black and decided were fundamentally different. But as political priorities change, definitions of race in America adjust right along with them. For example, if you were of Mexican birth or ancestry in the United States in 1929, you were considered white. Then the 1930 census changed that to non-white to limit immigration. Later, when the US needed to increase its labor force during World War II, these people were switched back to white. And what it took to be black once varied so wildly throughout the country, from 1/4 to 1/16 to the infamous 1 drop of African ancestry, that people could actually change races just by crossing state lines. Then suddenly in 2000, the government decided that Americans could be more than one race and added a multiracial category to the census. This has left many Americans scratching their heads when it comes to selecting who they are. As many as 6.2% of census respondents selected some other race in a 2010 survey. The idea that someone might look one way and identify another way, or that they might be really hard to place in a racial category, is not new. This is why there was a public debate about whether MSNBC's Karen Finney could say she was black, or how we can't even agree on the racial label assigned to the President of the United States. Of course, many people feel their racial identity is very clear and very permanent, but the fact that some people have changed theirs and that no one can really argue with them shows how shaky the very idea of race is. This is all because there isn't a race chromosome in our DNA that people can point to. It simply doesn't exist. When the medical community links race to health outcomes, it's really just using race as a substitute for other factors, such as where your ancestors came from, or the experiences of people who may have been put in the same racial group as you. Dorothy Roberts explains that sickle cell anemia is a prime example of this. The disease is linked to areas with high rates of malaria, which include some parts of Europe and Asia in addition to Africa. It's not actually about race at all. This, of course, does not mean that the concept of race isn't hugely important in our lives. The racial categories to which we're assigned can determine real-life experiences, they can drive political outcomes, and they can even make the difference between life and death. But understanding that racial categories are made up can give us an important perspective on where racism came from in the first place.
Awesome. So thank you for taking the time to watch that video. I think it's important to note that while that video itself uses a lot of American examples, very similar pieces have also happened in our country as well, from the way that we've treated those of Asian descent, whether we've deemed them to be racialized or not, has depended on how much they are needed or not. And in times of war, those who are perhaps considered a mixed race were considered racialized or not, dependent on how much they were needed. Now, like it says in the video, that doesn't mean that racism itself isn't real. We're going to dive into that in a moment, but I want you to take a moment to silently reflect, not only for a minute or two, um, what are some of the ways that race has shaped your life? Perhaps for the good, perhaps not so good, but just take a moment and reflect on that, and we'll come back here in just a minute. Awesome. Thank you for taking the time to reflect on that. I think one of the interesting pieces about this is that perhaps for the first time or for a limited amount of time, this is the first time that you've thought about how race has shaped your particular life and your particular experiences. For those who are racialized, though, the reality is that race has shaped their life usually on a daily basis, because it's something that we intrinsically, that as racialized folks, you can't hide it, if you will. When you go out, whether it's to school, whether it's to work, whether it's to the grocery store, you show up as a racialized individual. So the way that race has affected our life, has affected lives, can change in a wide variety of ways. When we look around at the population around the world, the reality is that only roughly 20% of the population identifies as white or Caucasian. Because of colonialism, which is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it in various ways. In this case, in the case of Canada, it consists of mostly European, folks of European descent coming here. White or being white is considered to be the default or normal way of being. Over time, what this ultimately means is that the systems and structures we build and create, such as sport, consist of a social construct around whiteness, which, as we talked about earlier, is really being white or being Caucasian as being the normal, proper way of being. And one of the biggest things I hope that you reflect on tonight is to ask yourselves, why is that considered to be the normal and or correct way of being? So let's dive into specifically racism. So racism is a system of power that structures opportunities and assigns value based on the social construct of race, where privilege is afforded to whiteness. When we look at racism and we go back to the video that we just watched, racism exists for one group to hold power over another group. It's less about necessarily what that person looks like versus being able to hold power over one group or another. And I think it's important to remember that as we combine that with the social construct of race that we talked about earlier. When we talk about like, where does racism come from? It's directly tied to colonialism and white supremacy. Um, in this session, we're reminded of Canada's colonial begins and the ongoing attitudes and impact of colonialism today. But the sad reality is that Indigenous, Black, and racialized folks continue to experience the uneven impacts of colonialism, with different things such as worse health outcomes, greater rates of incarceration, and discrimination. When we talk about white supremacy, I'm not necessarily referring to necessarily hate groups, but I'm referring to generally the term that describes the dominant bias towards white-centric set of ideas, thoughts, and beliefs and actions that white people are superior to Black people, Indigenous folks, and racialized folks. When we look at white privilege itself is an aspect of white supremacy culture. It promotes the belief that white Western ideas, thoughts, and bodies are the ideal and superior to those who are Black, Indigenous, and racialized folks. It can also sometimes show up with a sense of entitlement and expectation that a white person should be listened to because they demand something, or that their style of dress is the most professional, and that they're innate more trustworthy and unlikely to commit crimes. Again, like I mentioned off the top, I'm not necessarily speaking of directly you when we talk about white privilege and white supremacy. But it's important to remember these things as we really dive into racism. It's important for us to be able to acknowledge the privileges that we have. And in certain cases, some of the privilege that we have is tied into the color of our skin. When we dive into racism, we dive into different levels of racism. And let's start with structural racism. Simply put, this is the establishment of the hierarchy of groups based on perceived race. As I mentioned earlier, the purpose of structural racism is to designate superiority to one group in order to benefit from the oppression and exploitation of other groups. So structural racism, when we look at it, it tends to be more pronounced or more clear in different regions of Canada and the world compared to others. Simply put, how it shows up can be different depending on where we are geographically around the world. Now, next, let's go to systemic racism. Sometimes it's also referred to as institutional racism. But what it is, it's the policies and practices that exist throughout a whole society or organization that result in and support a continued unfair advantage to some people and unfair or harmful treatment of others based on race or ethnic group. If we continue on, we look at often practices and policies that are so baked into the way our society operates that sometimes we don't even know that they exist. So examples of structural racism include things like home ownership, specifically as it relates to redlining, the criminal justice system, through history and even today. We look at employment and wealth. We look at food insecurity, specifically as it relates specifically to sport. We even look at systemic racism as who are those who are expected to be on the water or on our fields. We look at different things like, for example, myself, as you may know from past sessions, I'm a curler. Curling's been my sport for a number of different years, for a number of years, excuse me. But when we look at that, I've been told before that I don't look like a curler. And while that comment itself isn't as harmful as you will as a racial slur, I think it's important that we dive into that and we ask ourselves, why do we expect a member of our sport to look a certain way? What does it mean that we're saying that you don't typically look like you're a stereotypical sailor, if you will? Next on the list is interpersonal racism, and this is typically what we think of when we talk about racism, which is the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors on individuals based on bias, stereotypes, and prejudice. Whether it's subtle or an unconscious, like a microaggression, or violent and overt, like saying a racial slur or fighting someone, or going to even more extremes of burning down their house, they all have a negative impact and immediate effect and immediately and even more detrimental over time. And then lastly, but certainly not least, is internalized racism. And this hits differently depending on whether or not you identify as racialized. As racialized folks are harmed by racism over time, we begin to accept thoughts, ideas, and prejudices of racism being valid. Folks who are not racialized can begin to think that they're superior than racialized folks, primarily because that's a mindset that's a very comfortable place to be in. It's easy to go day to day and not think about or talk about something that doesn't affect you directly. And having racist beliefs can sometimes feel easy or uncomfortable. In sport, where I've seen this quite often, is an individual wants to try out for a team or wants to participate in a sport. And when they show up, they don't see anybody who looks like them. Or for many years, perhaps on a local sailing team, there hasn't been anybody of color. So then the individual doesn't bother putting their name forward because they've never seen anybody on the team who looks like them, and therefore just immediately think, I'm not going to make that team anyway. So I'm not even going to bother trying out or putting my name forward. So with that said, let's go through some real life examples here. So on your screen here, this is a story that came to life this past August after Immigration Canada staff demanded an independent ombudsman investigate complaints of racism and discrimination from management of group leaders on a regular basis. In this survey that brought these complaints to the surface, one individual said this space enables this behavior. Another individual said, and this quote always sticks out to me, is that being a Black person here is an extreme sport. While progress was shown from a similar survey in 2021, many staff from many different groups, both racialized or not, acknowledge that the work is not yet done. And I think that's important that as we go to create better spaces and places for all individuals, regardless of their background or what they look like. It's okay to acknowledge that there's still much more work to be done, because we have to remember that this is a movement and not a moment. And when I say a movement, it means that we really need to do the work to make sure that everybody is able to show up in sport, and specifically in sailing, and be their authentic self. This next example is an example of interpersonal racism, and it comes from a survey that was released last October that showed out of over 5,000 employees of marginalized racial and ethnic backgrounds surveyed from 6 different countries, so not just here in Canada, but 2/3 of them have experienced racism in their working career, and 52% of them have encountered racism in their current jobs. When we look at an example of systemic racism, the picture on your screen is from an article from a Maclean's magazine that dives into racism experienced back in the mid-2010s from many in Winnipeg who identify as Indigenous, in particular Indigenous women. It's actually experiences like this that eventually led to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls calls to action that came out a few years ago in 2019. And then last but certainly not least, another example of structural racism is the story of a man by the name of Don Drummond, who studied and dove into the funding that First Nations schools received from Indigenous Affairs, which is now currently known as Indigenous Services Canada. But back in 2016, he showed how children at schools in First Nations communities received 30% less funding for education as children under provincial jurisdiction. 30% less, that's a third. Now, what I really like about this article in particular is not only does it highlight the gap that we just talked about, but it also shows how Don, by being an advocate and an ally, eventually pressured the government into making some changes that we saw a few years later in 2019. So earlier, we spoke about whiteness as being the norm or default, and thus making other cultures less than or not equal. The crux of that being very problematic, other than just one being better than the other, is that when we start to intentionally or unintentionally play into those beliefs, it can make the attitudes that go with it okay, which then makes things like microaggressions okay, which then makes verbal expressions or racial slurs okay, which can then lead into even worse things. This on your screen is what we refer to as the pyramids of harm. So basically, if we let one thing be okay, then that leads into the next thing and the next thing being okay. And then, of course, that leads into some very terrible spot areas of harm. So we've done a lot of talk about race and racism. Let's go into talking about anti-racism. So how do we speak up and use privilege we have in combating racism? We need to be anti-racist. When we look at being racist at its core, this means supporting a racist policy through actions or inaction and expressing a racist idea. When we look at being anti-racist, this is supporting an anti-racist policy through action or expressing an anti-racist idea. Now let's just hold on to those definitions in our mind for just a moment, because I have one more video here that I want to be able to show you. Then we're going to dive into this a little bit further. I'm going to go back to that chart in just a moment. We're going to play this video right now from Ibram X. Kennedy, who's the author of a book, one of my favorite books, called How to Be an Anti-Racist.
So my name is Ibram X. Kendi, and I'm the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist. And this book really seeks to show that the contrast is actually not between racist and not racist, but the contrast is between racist and anti-racist. What I think many people who self-identify as not racist don't realize is that really over the course of history, nearly every group of people that we actually consider to be racist have also identified as not racist, whether that's white supremacists today or segregationists of yesterday. And so really, each of us should be striving to be anti-racist, not necessarily striving to be not racist, because really that's a term primarily of denial, and it's a term really that doesn't have much meaning. But it does mean something to be racist. When someone says that there's something wrong with a racial group, they're being racist. When someone says there's nothing wrong with any of the racial groups, they're being anti-racist. When someone supports policies that create and reproduce racial inequity, they're being racist. When someone supports policies that yield and create racial equity, they're being an anti-racist. And these aren't necessarily identities or fixed categories or tattoos. Literally, what we're doing in each moment determines who and what we are in each moment. And people change from moment to moment and from year to year. And I think we should identify people based on what they're saying and doing, because no one ever becomes racist or even anti-racist. So my name is...
So with that being said, I want to reflect on this table for a moment, because when we talk about being anti-racist, it means being active in dismantling systems, structures, and policies and beliefs that support racism. Listen, when we cut it all away, I can recognize for some how it can be more comfortable to say nothing at all when we witness or see something racist. But when we say nothing at all, through our silence or through our inaction, that doesn't eliminate racism. In fact, what it does is we're saying through our inaction that what has just happened, whether it be a microaggression, whether it be a joke, whether it be a racial, so we're saying that that activity is okay. So let's imagine right now that somebody jumps in the Zoom call and they immediately say, well, there's a black person talking about racism. It should be a white person leading that discussion because white people are smarter than black people. Well, that person's coming in awful hot for a Tuesday evening. But if nobody says anything at all, then again, we are condoning the activity. Even in identifying that society has perhaps positioned your identity or race above others, that's a step in being non-racist. So the question becomes is how do we use the privilege or power that one might have in moving from non-racist to anti-racist?
So
I like this particular image. It's not necessarily by myself, it's by a woman by the name of Stephanie Nixon. Perfect. I think it's important to recognize that it's very difficult to see the other side of the coin depending on where you fall. So perhaps you identify as being on the top side of the coin. Perhaps you have a privilege that you have an advantage that others do not. You did not earn that advantage. You happen to have it simply because of who you are. In this particular case, the coin, it represents racism. But perhaps you find yourself on the bottom side of the coin or the side of oppression. You have a disadvantage that others do not. You did not earn it. And you have it because of who you happen to be. It's not necessarily because you've done something wrong or that you've said something incorrect. But it's very difficult to see the other side of the coin, but it's important for us to recognize on which side of the coin that we're on. So let's talk about some steps to anti-racism. The first one is know your positionality. So this refers to the awareness and understanding of knowing and recognizing how your own identity, experiences, and social location influence your perspectives, interactions, and privileges related to race. In short, it's understanding how your identity can be used to take action to challenge and dismantle the systems of racism and oppression. So let's think about where are some of the spaces and places where you hold the most power? Because this is where you can influence the most change. Next, it's important to acknowledge where you're at. It's also important to acknowledge where you're at on your journey of being an ally to racialized folks, which is a long way of saying being more anti-racist. This doesn't mean that you have to do anything when you witness something racist in nature, but what I'm referring to is the need to always do better. We are always learning, and we all need to do better to create more inclusive spaces and places. Next is understanding how you show up. We all have biases, and we need to recognize when and how they show up in order to interrupt those biases. If we can acknowledge what biases we have, we can then come up with a plan or strategy on how to mitigate them in order for us as individuals to be anti-racist. Next is being aware of white supremacy. So when I talk about being aware of white supremacy, it's that whiteness that we talked about earlier. It's that what we consider to be that normal sense of being. Because one of the things I really want you to think about as we wrap up these series of sessions is the way we currently offer sport in general, quote unquote, the best way. If we offer the sport of sailing in a different way, so long as Johnny or Susie isn't hurting themselves or somebody else, what difference does it make if we offer in a way that we traditionally haven't offered the sport of sailing in the past? And then lastly, there's we always want to choose action. This doesn't mean that we need to put ourselves in harm's way every time we see something racist, but whether it's showing leadership, in spaces and places to dismantle policies and culture that may be racist or in nature, could we show empathy to somebody on the receiving end of a racist comment? Because the reality is every little bit makes a difference. So now, I wanted to take some time to reflect in the Menti. We're going to take the next 15 minutes or so. I'm going to divide you up into breakout rooms. And I want you to answer these two questions, which honestly are both one and the same. What does being anti-racist sound like or look like to you? And how can we support marginalized communities in our daily lives within our communities? So there on your screen is the website. Go to menti.com and input that code. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for just a second so that I can drop this into the chat. Chat ever decides to work. There we go. Fantastic. So I dropped a direct link to the Menti into the chat. I'm also going to share my screen again here. And I'm going to divide you up into breakout groups, and we're going to answer this question on the screen. So I see at the moment we have about 25 participants. So I'm going to create 5 breakout rooms, so 5 folks in each. I encourage you to introduce yourselves in your particular breakout group. And let's have a conversation about this. So what would being anti-racist look like or sound like to you? And how can we support marginalized communities in our daily lives and within our communities? Does anybody have any questions before we open up these breakout rooms? Fantastic. Well, then I will see you back here in 13 minutes. If anybody's having any trouble joining breakout rooms, please by all means let me know and I can help. Happy to support. Awesome. So we have everybody back now, and there's been some awesome answers on being included in the Menti. I think a few that stick out to me. First off, just listen. I think it's important to listen to the experiences of racialized folks, in particular if they've had a bad experience within your particular organization. It's important to actively listen and to be able to figure out how we can best support and how to not allow those instances to happen again. Providing a pathway for groups to report witnessing racist behavior. That's definitely important, should be part of all of our codes of conduct within our spaces and places. Growing, of course, the number of marginalized groups, that's important. Reaching out is also important as well. It's really important that we go out into community and reach out and listen, how can we provide a sailing program? How can we provide an opportunity for those to be able to sail who want to sail? It's all important. So I'm going to stop sharing that screen. I'm going to share those results with Nick so that Sail Canada has them. And I'm going to go back to sharing the presentation. Thank you for taking part in that activity. Lots of great answers there. So as we wrap up tonight, I know we're coming up to time. I think it's important to take a look and acknowledge, where do you fall on this anti-racist growth zone? Are you in the fear zone, where perhaps you're avoiding hard questions or striving to be comfortable? Are you in the learning zone, where you're understanding your own privilege and ignoring racism? Or perhaps you acknowledge that you're vulnerable about your biases and knowledge gaps? Or are you in the growth zone, where you sit with your discomfort and don't let mistakes deter you from doing better? What I'm here to tell you tonight, if nothing else, if you forget what I look like, you forget my name, all that good stuff, I want you to remember this. I'm not here to criticize which zone that you're in. It's important for you to acknowledge which zone that you're in so that you can get pointed in the right direction and be able to do better. As we wrap up, a couple of things to note. As we saw in that in the coin row, you can't necessarily see or know the other side of the coin, which means that a person's experience is real, even if perhaps you don't understand it. As we go on this journey of allyship and go to be an anti-racist, it's important to note that sometimes we're going to get it wrong. It's also important to note that perhaps if you do something that is would denote racism or is racist in nature, but that doesn't mean that you're inherently racist and you get stamped with, if you will, this tag that you can never ever get rid of. When we do something that's racist in nature, it's up to us to apologize and do better next time. And it's important to know, as I say that folks are a combination of their parts. And what I really mean by that is that the lived experience that we have really drives a lot of the things that we do. So which means that this work can be hard. And it takes time to get to spaces and places where we're acting and behaving better. But it's important that we remember, like I talked about earlier, this is a movement and not a moment. So it's not just a moment of checking boxes and checking the boxes and making sure that we appear anti-racist so we can perhaps get more grants, so that we can look good in public. It's about recreating spaces and places so that sailing can be a sport that's truly accessible to everyone. So that's all I got. There is no more. Again, thank you very much for taking the time to join me this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you find yourselves in our lovely country. Thank you for taking the time to sit through all these sessions. If you happen to join me, I recognize some familiar names, so thank you for that. And now I'm going to stop talking and open the floor up to any questions that you might have.